Everyone. Welcome to the August 19th, 2019 online lecture replacement for conflict and contention in African politics at UCSD, summer of 2019. Today we're going to talk about issues related to individual level recruitment to civil conflict. So just to recap relatively quickly, we spent the last couple of class sessions talking about mechanisms that might help us explain variation in the incidence of civil conflict at the country level, where we asked what it might be about countries, the politics and economics of countries that explains variation in the dependent variable of whether or not they experience a civil war as a country. We then spent some time discussing community level mobilization, why it is that there are certain communities of people that seem to join civil wars. And again, we're looking at sort of economic or social indicators that might suggest to us that certain communities are more susceptible to mobilize. So now within a country that is experiencing a civil war, the dependent variable we care about is community level mobilization. Now in this last week worth of classes or readings in which we're thinking about the start of civil wars, we're going to address the question of what motivates individuals to join the conflict. So now we're going to elide the question of community level mobilization entirely. And to some extent, we're even going to elide the question of whether a conflict or an insurgent group ever gets active enough to meet the threshold for a civil war in that correlates of war definition that we were given in Collier and Hoffler. There have to be 1,000 battle deaths. And I'm just going to ask what it is about particular people that make them interested in joining a civil conflict. Now, the first reading we're going to tackle for this is Who Fights? McCartan Humphreys and Jeremy Weinstein. We'll see Jeremy Weinstein again later in the week on Wednesday, I guess, and we'll talk about his theory about why certain insurgencies abuse civilians and others don't. Okay, what are the puzzles here? Obviously, we've already sort of laid this out in the introductory slides. Who fights? Why? But there's also, interestingly, one of the things that makes this article influential in this space is that they ask the reciprocal question, who rebels, and also who defends the government? Is there a difference between the sort of person who joins a rebellion and the characteristics of or influences on individuals who decide to defend the government? Before we move on from the puzzle, why is it important to understand these questions? What's the policy sales pitch here? Why would anyone care about this issue? Well, the obvious answer is that ending civil wars and protecting civilians might be affected by the motivations that individuals have to fight. So what do you think before we get into the lecture? Why might some people join a rebellion? What problem will rebel groups have recruiting, and what game does this look like? So of course we've asked this question before. We're going to see some familiar explanations for individual motivations to fight. And the problem that we're really looking for here again is some version of the prisoner's dilemma or the free rider problem or the collective action problem that we faced before, which is to the extent that these groups are intending to change something about political or social or economic structure, there's no rational reason for any individual person to join the fight. Their gun is unlikely to make that much of a difference. If the rebels win, they get to partake of the new order, and if the rebels lose, at least they didn't stick their neck out engaging in the fight. So part of what we're going to be looking at here in this puzzle, what's baked into this entire literature and also into this particular text, is this question of how you influence people to fight around this pernicious free rider problem. Okay, there are three main explanations or categories of explanations here, all of which we've seen in some form or another before. The first are what Humphreys and Weinstein refer to as expressive or grievance explanations. A person joins the fight because they're excluded in some sort of economic, political, or social way. And they want to change the status quo. They want to be able to participate. They want to be included instead of excluded. We look to who gets abused, and we see that it's typically rural dwellers, right? Isolated villages in underdeveloped countries oftentimes don't have public services. They are oftentimes comprised of ethnic groups that are considered to be outsiders with respect to the ethnic groups that comprise the ruling party. And their peripheral location in the economic and geographic life of these countries makes it easy to ignore their demands um, because it's difficult for them to come together and create a threat. Of course, these rural dwellers are going to be excluded. But we're still left with this puzzle, right? Despite the fact that we have lots of research that shows that rural dwellers are excluded and that the majority of revolutions, at least in the post-Cold War era, started in rural areas, we still don't know why some people fight and others don't. So part of the work that's being done here, part of how we end up with this puzzle, is that Humphreys and Weinstein are framing the question a little bit differently. Okay, so a handful of more precise mechanisms within the expressive or grievance explanation school that attempt to explain how this collective action problem is mitigated. The first, Jeffrey Page, makes an argument that what really matters for mobilization, what really matters for individuals being enticed in ways that overcome the free riding dilemma, has to do with the structure of the community in which the revolution takes place. So we're actually kind of smuggling in this intermediate level explanation here that militates between individual level incentives and community structure. And so what Page argues, Page is looking at labor revolutions in Latin America in the 1950s and 60s, and what he finds is that groups of laborers that are relatively geographically dispersed, for example, maize farmers or wheat farmers in Latin America, who live far away from one another, have a much more difficult time overcoming the collective action problem because there's higher barriers to entry in the revolution, right? You have a further distance to communicate, your community is less tightly knit, and so your ability to leverage the sorts of strategies that solve collective action problems, whether these are emotional and social strategies or whether they're selective incentives, is really not there compared to more concentrated industries. The archetypical industry that Page notes tends to result or be able to mobilize into revolutions are coffee farmers who live on fincas. They tend to be housed in common dorms. Coffee is an extremely labor-intensive crop that doesn't take lots of territory, and so you have lots of people who may have a grievance that live in close proximity. And so Page's hypothesis, if revolution is facilitated by the ability to weigh upon the conscience of your fellow laborers, he argues that there should be a correlation between failed and successful revolutionary mobilization that correlates with how closely geographically located these people are. And he sees the fact that most corn revolutions were stunted and most coffee revolutions succeeded as being evidence that part of what's happening here has to do with the structure of the community or the closeness or togetherness of the people who have a common cause to fight. If those people are relatively separated, it's harder to organize them. If they're closer together, it's easier to organize them. James Scott provides an alternative organization. This is the same Scott who wrote Seeing Like a State that we tackled in the first week of class. Scott spent some time in Southeast Asia and observed that communities which are diverse in terms of their class or ethnic structures, but are sort of geographically and politically forced together by dint of where they live, are willing to come together when the subsistence of the lowest or poorest members of society are threatened. Why, Scott wonders, would the relatively rich in a village come together to defend the relatively poor if some social shock threatened their survival? Well, the relatively rich in a particular village rely on the labor and presence of the relatively poor to be rich. If you take away the poor people, there's no one you can be rich over. So Scott argues that there is something of a moral ecosystem, a way in which geographical communities come to see themselves as being intertwined, that unites them in certain sorts of struggles across class or ethnic lines. And so the root of this expressive or grievance explanation is when the entire community's economic system is threatened. And this is different than Page's explanation that some grievances mobilize while others don't because the structure of the community in which the grievance lies is relatively tight-knit versus relatively dispersed. A third example of a grievance explanation that's important in this literature comes from Richard Merton, and before that actually Emil Durkheim, one of the fathers of modern sociology. Merton argues for a concept called anomie. An anomie refers to the circumstances under which social groups who are told how they can succeed in society engage in those behaviors, they invest in the norms and morals and economic pathways that society has provided them, and then their expectations are frustrated. So one of the examples, one of the motivating examples for Merton is youth, young people who live in ethnic ghettos. They're told by society about an American dream, about the way that they can participate in society, get educated, get jobs, make themselves better than their parents were, and experience more success, but who by dint of some form of racism or ethnic chauvinism or even classism are denied a meaningful opportunity to participate in the legal economy. Not only do these people turn to crime, but instead of feeling guilty about being criminals, they create cultural structures that glorify it. And so what you end up with are these sort of revolutionary subaltern subcultures. And what motivates people to join these subcultures is in part a rational economic understanding from watching people who have gone before them, recognizing that the structures and opportunities that society promises them are false, but also the fact that this culture of rebellion encourages them to be part of an alternative society. And so you have, in some sort of a form, like a push circumstance, a fact that there's no other way to make money, and a pull circumstance, which is the glorification of people who make their living by defying the rules of society that are characterized as being unfair. In addition to expressive or grievance explanations, Humphreys and Weinstein consider the possibility that selective incentives, like direct threats or payments, why, of course, would this matter? Well, for starters, from the collective action problem standpoint, you solve the collective action problem relatively quickly by offering people selective incentives. Oh, you think you can free ride? Well, if you don't join the rebellion, we're going to harm you or we're going to harm your family. Oh, you don't think that your gun matters? Well, it doesn't matter. We're going to pay you for it anyway. Now there are incentives that adhere to the individual that are different from the incentives that adhere based upon their membership in the group. And by making those incentives selective or private or club goods rather than public goods, you can encourage people to join your rebellion. Now, as hinted at in this slide, there are sort of two types of selective incentives that Humphreys and Weinstein argue might matter. The first are pull factors. These are payments made to the individual, made to their families, or maybe the pull factor is actually that a person who is surrounded by armed groups, the state, a rebel group or two, decides which group is likely to provide public goods in the future, and they make their decision to join a rebel group or to fight for the state based upon which group they think is going to provide the better package of economic public goods in the future. So in this circumstance, they're not fighting for any sort of expressive or grievance reason. It is all about their pocketbook. It is a political economic explanation for civil conflict, but it is about government services. It is about the credibility of promises that each side makes to provide a better life for the individual and their family. In addition to pull factors, of course, we have push factors. These are threats against safety. Two sorts of threats against safety. One, obviously, is a direct threat from the rebel group, join us or die. and another is a threat from the opposition. We recognize you ethnically as being part of the opposition group, and so therefore we're going to threaten and harass you. We're not going to give you an opportunity to join our side. And Humphreys and Weinstein argue that this pushes, or could push, otherwise pacifistic individuals to defend themselves by joining the opposite side. And most of you in your groups have probably started doing some of the reading for the Rwanda case. You can see, particularly in Haitian's reading, that this happens to the Batutsi groups in Rwanda, right? The Hutu government and the Hutu social groups that are pushing the genocide make it very clear that anyone who is Tutsi or is part Tutsi or has Tutsi family or even practices a sort of moderate form of Bahutu nationalism is at risk for being targeted by the Hutu militias. And so this convinces people who are on the Tutsi side, after the genocide ends, when these threats are still ongoing, particularly in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, that they need to organize militias that protect Tutsi identities. Okay, so our final group of individual explanations that Humphreys and Weinstein intend to test in this paper relate to social networks. Here we have a political, sociological, or moral set of explanations for individuals joining civil conflict. And the basic idea here is that potential recruits don't respond to global grievances that they feel toward the system or toward society, and they don't respond to selective incentives. Instead, what's happening essentially is that they're facing some sort of peer pressure, and they respond to the values and their desires of their family or friends, and they're more likely to join either the state or the rebel group if they have the sense that their network values that participation. They want to look good to their network. Where social networks have these elements that are listed here on the slide, they can pressure individuals to act despite the collective action problem. So we're citing Michael Taylor here, and we're talking about communities that have memberships with shared values and beliefs, relationships that are direct and many-sided, so we need to see individually and know individually all of the people in our community, and we need to have relationships with them that happen in more than one space. People that we trade with are also our friends. They're also involved in our religion. They have positions of political power. And then lastly, the practices within the community value generalized reciprocity. That is, we live in a community that morally prefers that you treat your neighbor as you expect to be treated. Now, where have we seen this definition of strong communities before? Okay, hopefully you remember this from Peterson, who makes the argument that strong subcommunities within geographic communities create these same types of rewards. Humphreys and Weinstein are citing Michael Taylor here instead of citing Roger Peterson, partly because Roger Peterson is also citing Michael Taylor for the same idea. This Taylor 1988 reading is seen as an extremely influential theoretical description of what a strong community looks like for the purposes of thinking about Civil War mobilization. So, what you should be thinking at this point, of course, having gone through these slides, is that not only have we adapted to some extent the logics that explain country and community level mobilization for conflict to think about the same sets of dilemmas with respect to individuals, but we're actually to some extent blending a little bit back and forth between what it means for a community to mobilize and what it means for an individual to mobilize. Of course, a community doesn't mobilize unless individuals within it mobilize, and of course a country doesn't experience a successful attempt at civil rebellion unless enough communities and individuals within that country respond to the call. So there is something of an additive effect here, and if you're interested in civil conflict or security issues for a career, these are the sorts of blendings that you might want to start to notice and think about how you test. Okay, so Humphreys and Weinstein are going to test these theories in the context of Sierra Leone, which in the 1980s was run by an ambivalent single-party state. This was a government that was not particularly closely involved in providing services. It was a government that was not particularly closely involved in any sort of good faith governance. They excluded lots of ethnic minorities. They left large swaths of the countryside underdeveloped, and they developed a very extractive set of governance procedures. So these are like roving bandits who have just settled down in the 1980s in Sierra Leone. In this context, the Revolutionary United Front, which was made up mostly of student activists who were opposed to Sierra Leone's single party, the All People's Congress, trained and hid in Liberia, the country next door to Sierra Leone, and came across the border and attacked outposts in Sierra Leone in 1991. They're supported by a Liberian dictator by the name of Charles Taylor. And for those of you who are a little bit older, you may recognize this name. Charles Taylor is sort of one of the big men of African politics who is seen as perpetuating a lot of the Blood Diamond style wars. Taylor was eventually tried and convicted of war crimes in his own country and is still in prison serving the sentence today. During the first year of the war, the Revolutionary United Front took control of large swaths of territory in eastern and southern Sierra Leone. These swaths of territory just happened to be rich in alluvial diamonds, the rocks that gentleman is throwing into the sieve there. Something like a third of those rocks are actually diamonds that are have embedded in other stones. The government's ineffective response to the RUF and the disruption in the government's diamond production precipitated a military coup in April of 1992 by an organization known as the National Provisional Ruling Council. So you have an insurgency happening in the rural areas of Sierra Leone, and because the government is paying insufficient attention to it, the military engages in a coup against the government. This isn't the first time, or I'm sorry, I should say, this isn't the last time you're going to hear this story in Africa. When we talk about the Azawad Rebellion in northern Mali and the military coup that takes place in the context of the Azawad Rebellion, it's a very, very similar story. The military and the police are, at least ostensibly, the story that they tell that justifies the coup is that they're sick of having their lives be put on the line by a government that's not doing an effective job at reaching out and winning hearts and minds in the population they're supposed to be defending, engages in a coup in order to put themselves in less danger, change the dynamic, and put themselves in control. The army, after this point, advances on the Revolutionary United Front, but then their advance stalls. Even the new military government doesn't seem capable of completely dislodging the RUF from extremely rural parts of Sierra Leone. This is probably because the rebels are making a lot of money off of diamonds. It's probably also because these areas are extremely rural. There's a lot of grievance. This is the sort of territory in which we might argue that the explanation for the war is overdetermined. There's grievance, there's opportunity, there's greed motivations, and so the new military government of Sierra Leone stalls in their advances against the Revolutionary United Front once they meet a certain level of ruralness. As a result of that stalling, the army signed a major contract with South African mercenaries known as Executive Outcomes, many of whom are pictured here. Executive Outcomes and the Army of Sierra Leone fought the RUF to a standstill during this time. As a result of the standstill and the amount of bloodshed that was happening, the RUF signed a peace accord in Abidjan that returned civilian rule to Sierra Leone in 1996. After civilian rule returned, we see the rise of state paramilitary groups called the Civil Defense Forces. In 1997, these groups start to make up a large proportion of the government's forces. And at that time, there's another coup. The civilian government falls. And in response to the fall of the civilian government, we see a new rebel group arise called the AFRC, which joins forces with the Revolutionary United Front and fights again until a new peace treaty is signed in 1999, which is held sometimes uneasily through to today. So we have a lot of different parties here, quite a few groups that come and go, quite a few different strategies that are used on both sides. This offers Humphreys and Weinstein an advantage in using the case of Sierra Leone to test some of their theories. And that advantage is that rural civilians were recruited into and fought for all types of groups. So we can disaggregate in principle what the differences is between people who join each organization, what each type of person's individual circumstances were. Okay, let's talk just a little bit about the research design. In order to plumb these questions, Humphreys and Weinstein designed a survey. And there are some biases in the way that this survey is designed, and it will be interesting to think through the extent to which you believe that these biases are accounted for or mitigated by Humphreys and Weinstein's thoughtfulness on this issue. So here's how the survey is designed. First, Humphreys and Weinstein randomly chose communities. In the context of Sierra Leone, it's a little bit different in the way that Humphreys and Weinstein see it from the context of Latvia and Lithuania as it was described to us by Roger Peterson. Here you didn't have whole communities that seemed to roll together. Instead, you had communities that were split in terms of whether they withdrew from the war entirely or whether they fought for one of the rebel groups or one of the state groups. So once we've chosen a community, we gather lists of ex-combatants in each. Then we match the lists of the ex-combatants with lists of community members of the same age and sex who did not fight. So why are we doing this, right? Obviously, if we go out into these communities and we interview only people who fought, we have no baseline for comparison. We have no way to know how the average profile of a fighter compares to the average profile of someone who stayed out of the conflict. We might be able to compare state fighters, those who joined the CDF, with those who joined the RUF and its allies, but we wouldn't be able to compare them to people who decided not to fight at all. One of the most important threats to this research design would be that somehow people who weren't approached at all by military groups were the ones who were most likely to remain peaceful. And this is a threat because if people who remained peaceful tended to remain peaceful because they were never recruited, we might think that they were different in some way than those people who were recruited. And that would mean that our research design would measure differences between soldiers and those who were never going to fight anyway. And so the real issue of recruitment isn't about the individual's choice at that point, but about the choice that the Revolutionary Party makes. And we'll talk about that in our upcoming slides with Berman. But as it happens, 40% of the people who did not fight were approached by combatant groups. And so Humphreys and Weinstein make the argument that in particular, comparing the difference between these 40% and those who fought, but also the broader group of non-combatants makes sense. We actually are comparing two similar groups of people, or at least that are similar in baseline ways, and then the differences, the selective differences between these groups can tell us something about how individuals come to fight. Okay, so now that we have the context and we understand the theories and we know a little bit about the research design, we can derive some hypotheses. We can ask how Humphreys and Weinstein actually plan to test these issues and ask about the extent to which those tests seem to operationalize or intuitively represent the heart of the theory that we're after. Okay, so if we were in class on this slide, I might ask you to brainstorm some independent variables, some things we could go out and measure that might represent grievance explanations or selective incentive explanations or social network explanations, but obviously we can't. So we'll just move on, I suppose. So here are the three hypotheses that Humphreys and Weinstein propose in order to test expressive or grievance explanations for conflict. Remember, we're measuring this now at the individual level, not at the community or national level. So we're going to look at three separate relationships. One, how economically deprived is the respondent to the survey? Our hypothesis, if expressive or grievance explanations are true, our hypothesis should be, of course, that people who are more economically deprived are more likely to join rebellions. Second, we might ask whether they're marginalized from political decision making. And third, ask whether they are alienated from mainstream political processes. So again, we expect that people who participate will be more marginalized or more alienated. And going all the way back to our statistics lecture, I guess I say all the way back, but it was only last week, what we should be predicting is sort of a difference in means test here, where our null hypothesis, the hypothesis that should be true if the theory is false, is that there's no difference. There's no economic difference between fighters and non-fighters. There's no difference in marginalization or alienization between fighters and non-fighters. Among selective incentives, we get some relatively straightforward hypotheses. At least the first one is relatively straightforward. We would expect, if selective incentives are effective at recruiting people for risky participation in rebellion on either side, that people who join insurgent forces or fight against insurgent forces for the state say that they expect to receive selective incentives. The fighting parties have offered them some form of money or have made speeches in their communities, tell them we're actually going to take your complaints about public good seriously. And if we find that the people who fight report more often that they received selective incentive offers, then we know that something about the selective incentive theory might be true. Hypothesis 5 hedges between the types of threats that a person might receive by just saying people who fight will believe that they're safer inside the fighting faction than outside of it. Now notice that this might mean that they were threatened by either side. Maybe I believe that I'm safer inside the fighting unit than outside of it because that fighting unit has told me that I'm not safe, that they will come and find me if I don't join. Maybe I feel safer in that fighting unit because the opposing side has made threats against me and my family, and I feel that the best way to defend my family and my interests is by joining a group. Social networks. Two hypotheses again. One is that members of their community are active in the social movement, so we again should think that if the social network theory of recruitment is true, that people who join armed organizations during civil war will report that members of their social network were active in those same groups, whereas people who refuse to fight won't make these types of reports. And then lastly, we would argue that the community is characterized by that strong social structure that Michael Taylor has described for us both in the Peterson reading and now in Humphreys and Weinstein. So we should see that people join one group or the other, I suppose, when they live in a community that's characterized by strong social structures. Now, how these things are actually measured down to the nitty-gritty, I've sort of avoided talking about this with the first 5 hypotheses. We'll get to it a little bit in the coming results slides. But how these particular hypotheses are measured is actually pretty interesting. To measure hypothesis 6, we're going to ask how people first encountered whichever armed group they encountered first. So what we expect is that combatants will tell you more often that their first encounter with the armed group they eventually joined was through a friend. Someone introduced me. On the other hand, we should expect that non-combatants will have their first experience with the armed group through some non-social way, some accidental connection. Now notice that this excludes from measurement any of the myriad other ways that a social network might prevail its influence upon an individual making a decision. So we're not asking, for example, did your grandpa think that RUF were amazing, and then he raised you so you went off and joined the RUF even though you didn't actually know anyone? That could be the mechanism that causes people to join, but we're not going to be able to measure that mechanism using this particular measurement strategy. What Humphreys and Weinstein have done is constrain their test to an even more particular mechanism whereby the introduction is facilitated by someone in your social group, and therefore you take the introduction more seriously. With respect to the last hypothesis, hypothesis 7, the way we're going to measure whether or not a community has strong social ties of the type that Taylor describes is asking whether or not that particular village is accessible by foot or boat only, or whether that village has a road that connects it to the rest of Sierra Leone. This is a very interesting one, right? What's the animating assumption here? Humphreys and Weinstein are assuming that if a village is only accessible by foot or by boat, people must leave it less frequently. You're born there, you're likely to stay there. Without roads, your population is likely to remain small. And so they assume that this accessibility measure operationalizes very closely what it means to actually have a strong community. Okay, so having gone through these hypotheses, we can now start looking at the tests. A very, very basic test here, just sort of eyeballing things. We ask people why they joined, and we compare the RUF to the CDF. A few things jump out at me, at least. The majority of people who joined the CDF claim that they did so, at least in part, because they agreed with the group's political goals. Comparatively few of the RUF members said the same. Only 10%, in fact, believed that they agreed with the RUF's political goals. So why did people join the RUF? Well, almost 90% of people say that they were abducted. Now, we'll talk a little bit later about what abduction means and whether we can interpret abduction to be totally forcible under these circumstances. But this is a pretty massive difference. Another thing that shows up in most accounts, or at least almost all accounts of joining, is people claiming that they were scared about what would happen if they didn't choose to join. Now, it's entirely possible that when this 41% of people who join the RUF say that, what they're referring to is the threats they received when they were kidnapped, whereas this 51% were afraid of what would happen if they didn't join, in the sense that they mean their political goals would be frustrated, that the RUF would win the war and they would live under the tyranny of the RUF. So again, we have two relatively similar results, and we're kind of asked to interpret them as though they mean similar things. But in light of the other data we have, it doesn't seem entirely clear that we ought to interpret this fear as being evidence of the same mechanism for recruitment in both groups. Here is our gigantic regression table. We know that we're looking for the stars. Let's go through each of these hypotheses one by one. So mud walls operationalized poverty, right? People who have mud walls are more likely to be economically deprived than people who have brick walls or wood walls or cement walls or walls of any other material. And so we see that there is a statistically significant relationship across all models, right? Here we're talking about the abductees and the volunteers into the RUF, and the volunteers to the CDF all had mud walls. That's interesting, right? Humphreys and Weinstein interpret this as evidence that grievance matters, that people who are poor tend to feel like they are being victimized by one side or the other. But what do you think about this? I think it's interesting that mud walls predict participation in both groups, both the government supporting group and the rebel supporting group. Who would volunteers for the CDF feel a grievance against that they join because they have mud walls? They're joining to fight for the state, right? So they're joining to keep the social and economic order as it stands. They're fundamentally conservative. They want to keep what they have. What other explanation might be consistent with this finding that mud walls, people who live in houses with mud walls, are more likely to fight? Well, of course, it might also be possible to interpret this as evidence that some form of opportunity or incentive structure really matters, right? Notice down here, which we'll get to in a minute, that most people were offered some sort of money to join, or there was a significant relationship between being offered money to join and joining. Maybe when we offer poor people money to fight, they're more likely to take it than when we offer rich people money to fight. So it's possible that this result is somewhat ambiguous, even though we interpret it in the confines of this paper as evidence for the grievance motivation. Lack of education. This also operationalizes grievance, but we have the same sort of problem, right? Here we see that being poorly educated likely leads to participation in war. And again, we might ask whether this tells us that people who are undereducated are fighting against the government because they feel the government isn't offering them enough opportunities, or whether they're just fighting because they were offered a selective incentive and they don't see their future as having any sort of an opportunity that they'd be giving up in order to fight. And one of the reasons I think that this might be the better interpretation of this test is that, again, people who have under a secondary education are more likely to fight for the state, and they're more likely to fight against it. And so there must be something happening here outside of there being a mainstream interpretation that the state is not providing schools. Because if that were what was happening and that were creating grievances, what we would expect is that these people wouldn't join to fight for the state. It's very interesting stuff. Okay. For this purpose, asking whether or not these groups felt marginalized, the individuals felt marginalized from normal politics, Humphreys and Weinstein asked if they supported the party that was out of power during the single-party Sierra Leone years. Does that predict people who fight for the RUF? Right? And it does actually predict people who volunteered for the RUF. But it doesn't predict people who got kidnapped. And of course, it doesn't predict people who were fighting for the state, right? So the RUF's platform might not have been very popular, which required them to kidnap people, but to their target audience, it did matter. These people were supporters of an opposition party that was denied power, and maybe part of the reason that they decided to fight or decided to volunteer, in this case, was because they felt like they had been taken from power, or power had been taken from them, I suppose I should say. Their power to vote was stolen. We should note, despite this, that the pro-government militias cited ideology. The members of the pro-government militias cited ideology more often than did fighters for the RUF. And we should also note that while the RUF claimed to represent the disenfranchised, most of the volunteers who were recruited were sent from the upper class, and they were recruited through secret societies that were headed by local chiefs and other notables. And so, the fact that these people are out of political power might not jive very well with the fact that they were out of economic power. So again, more reasons to think through how we interpret these tests together very carefully. Basically, everyone talked about being offered money, even the abductees. Those abductees also said they felt safer inside the group. Now, why might that be? So probably the most straightforward explanation is that you can reinforce the interest of people you've abducted in fighting for your rebel army by offering them money once you kidnap them, and by threatening them if they leave. We can use carrots and sticks simultaneously, and so that's actually what Humphreys and Weinstein conclude the RUF is doing in this case. All right, and then lastly, we see that there is a substantial number of people in the RUF, both abductees and volunteers, who report that they were introduced to the RUF by their friends. Interesting. Why might abductees still report that they were introduced to the RUF by their friends. Well, one of the possible reasons that Humphreys and Weinstein consider is that some of these abductions were not really abductions. Some of these abductions might have happened from villages where the elders, by which I don't mean official village elders, but more people who are older, are relatively conservative and support the government. But the youngsters support the RUF and they want to go fight for the RUF and they want to do it without bringing shame onto their family. And so they engineer a consensual kidnapping that gives them plausible deniability to claim they never intended to fight for the RUF, but in fact end up fighting for the RUF. And this is another way that we might reconcile why abductees are offered money in order to join, or why they feel safer inside the group. Maybe they engineered their own abduction because they were offered money or because they were offered security. Also worth noting here that being in a remote village seems not to matter one way or the other, but remember that this is used to operationalize strong social structure, right? So, could it be that this is just a bad measurement of strong social structure, and that if we found a better one, the correlation would emerge? Okay. Here we can see that there might be something of a link between kidnapping and social structure. In fact, opposite of what I suggested in the last slide, the elders sometimes consented to the kidnapping of village kids. The RUF knew that the village elders needed cover from the state. These villages didn't want to be seen as supporting the RUF, even though they did. And so they consented to their young men being kidnapped. Now remember back to Migdal, where we talked about the pressures that exist in communities that find themselves between rebel groups or non-state social groups and the state. Right here we see village elders telling the RUF, yes, we'd love to join. We'd love to send our sons and daughters to fight for you, but we're worried about what the state will do to our community. And so the RUF says, fine, we'll kidnap some. And the chiefs say, okay. Now we can take this one level deeper, right? Like at this point, Humphreys and Weinstein are arguing that this suggests that the village elders preferred the RUF, but go back to Migdal's dilemma. It's possible that the village elders recognized that the RUF presence meant that they were helpless. They couldn't tell the RUF no, and so they struck this deal that limited the extent to which the RUF could affect their communities, and they saw that as the best way, the best middle ground between the opposing desires of two parties. There's an old African proverb, when the elephants dance, it is the grass that gets trampled, and here we might actually be looking at some evidence of exactly that type of mechanism. These people are stuck between two elephants, and they have very little that they can do to defend themselves besides attempt to strike deals that appear palatable or plausibly deniable to the opposite side. All right, a couple of reflection questions. First and most important, why do people agree to fight insurgencies, right? And how does that compare to why they agreed to fight for the state? What were the conclusions of this study? And second, how much can you gain from interpreting or looking at the difference in the results between the RUF and CDF recruits? And can we use these lessons to learn about other conflicts? Or are these answers and our analysis of these answers so deeply embedded in our now rudimentary understanding of the Sierra Leonean conflict as to not be useful in other circumstances? And then lastly, is this grievance and expression, or is this selective incentives? How would we know whether the poverty and the lack of services has made people mad, or whether it has made them more susceptible to selective incentives? We see again this problem of overdeterminism. People who are denied services, people who are poor, are likely to be responsive in both of these capacities. Okay, so that closes us out of our discussion of the individual rationale of people who decide to join rebel groups, and now we're going to transition to sort of a mirror image problem, which is how do rebel groups choose people to fight for them? There's an old story told by Ariel Marari, who is an Israeli scholar who studied the Palestinian Liberation Organization for a number of years. And he reports that during an interview with one of the PLO's head managers in prison, he asked why it was that the PLO seemed so able to attract engineers, highly educated Arabs to fight for their cause. Why did it seem like disproportionate numbers of educated, skilled young Arabs were willing to throw their lives away in the PLO? Notice that this is counterintuitive precisely for the selective incentive or opportunity mechanisms we've already discussed. These are exactly the people we should expect should turn away from rebel organizations and focus on their personal development. They have a way forward. Well, Marari was surprised by the answer. The PLO operative said, listen, we're overwhelmed with applications from farmers and poor people. Those are the people who have the grievances. Those are the people who are interested in taking small amounts of pay to do very, very dangerous and sometimes suicidal work. Those are really the people that we're after. The thing is, when we're approached by an engineer, when we're approached by a young lawyer, we always take them. Those are the best candidates for the position. We know they're not going to mess things up. And so what you see is that the high-profile attacks are carried out by our best operatives, and that leads you to a misunderstanding of our organizational capacity. It leads you to believe that we are recruiting heavily from among the ranks of highly educated Arabs, when in fact we truly struggle in those demographics. It's just that we selectively employ those people to do the things that we believe are the most important. Ellie Berman approaches this problem in a similar way. He asks, how is it that rebel groups can attract and retain high caliber employees? We know that these are risky circumstances, and we know that they're likely to attract essentially the dregs who have no other alternatives. So how do they manage this problem? Let's take a look at the empirical and theoretical puzzles that Berman weaves together in this reading. The empirical puzzle, the Taliban. Afghanistan was largely considered an ungovernable country. And the puzzle gets even more puzzling when you think that the group of people who consolidated power over Afghanistan did so by using a series of roadblocks, right? So let's think for a second about the way that the Taliban became powerful, right? There was a trade road that ran across the country that at one point had been governed by a number of rebel groups who charged taxes to cross through their checkpoints that depended highly on the value of what was in the truck and the mood of the people who were manning the checkpoint that day. Robbery was common. Rather than being asked to pay a tax, you were told to just get out of your truck and abandon your cargo. And as a result, cargo passage through Afghanistan ground to a halt. There was no certainty that if you sent a truck across Afghanistan, it would make it to the other side. So the Taliban decided, well, what we ought to do is take over and guard this road and actually tax people a predictable amount of money and always allow the trucks through. Well, this is, of course, easier said than done, right? And most of you have a very, at least background understanding of Afghanistan as being a large and sparsely populated place, and many of these roadblocks existed in places that were extremely isolated and rural. And so what sort of a problem does this give rise to? Hopefully you were thinking about a principal agent problem. The lackeys who are sent out into the hinterlands to tax these trucks as they came through are not your highest paid operatives. They're not people who have opportunities to make a lot of money in other places. And sometimes the cargo that the trucks were carrying is worth many times what they would be expected to make in their lives. And yet, in order to become a credible governing presence, in order to raise any amount of money from this road, the Taliban needed to commit credibly to keeping traffic open, and they did. Very, very, very rarely were any of these trucks hijacked by Taliban operatives, and when they were, the Taliban was able to track them down and get revenge. So how did this happen? Right? I guess I should have explained that on the slide where I had a picture of one of the roadblocks. Oops. So we know that there's a policy question and a moral question that's buried in here. The Taliban rule was disastrous for Afghanistan. It was a horror show for its civilians, and it was enabled by their initial success at opening and guarding these trade routes. It was enabled by their initial success at managing an intense principal agent problem. So how did they do it? Not only were the Taliban able to guard these roadblocks in a credible way, but they used that money to transform themselves from a bunch of relatively uneducated Central Asian hicks into a credible fighting force, one that was capable of controlling large swaths of territory in this region. So this leads us to a theoretical puzzle. How do we maintain secrecy and loyalty in organizations that are so riddled with a principal agent problem? I should take this moment to note that Ellie Berman teaches in the econ department here at UCSD. He sometimes has a course on illicit economics that is extremely interesting and worth taking. And in order to get some insight into his puzzle, he interviewed another UCSD professor named Sam Popkin, who spent a number of weeks in prison for defending sources that helped him write his book about very similar problems with respect to the Viet Cong. And here is Popkin reporting some interviews that he did to Ellie among the Viet Cong population. So here Popkin asks if one of your members is killed, how long does it take for the organization to recover? The Viet Cong rebel says a few days. And if someone defected, between a week and 2 months. Why is it so much worse if someone defects? Well, of course, if someone dies, you just have the transactional cost of replacing them with someone who's trained to do that job. But if a member defects, they take with them to a rival organization all sorts of intelligence that requires you to adjust your entire business operation plan. So, not only for the purposes of maintaining the taxation on trade routes, in the specific example of Afghanistan and the Taliban, is the principal agent problem important to rebel groups, but also because these people are constantly going to be asked to turn themselves into the state. They're constantly going to be incentivized to defect. And you need to have, in order to have a successful rebel group, you need to have people or agents that you trust not to defect, right? So the secrecy problem is really similar to the temptation to steal from a convoy. If you're being threatened with jail time or worse, or you're being incentivized with lots of money, you'll be tempted to defect. Okay, so what does this have to do with people who are willing to pay to use the Taliban's highway, right? This becomes doubly important because if traders think that the Taliban cannot manage their principal agent problem, they'll never start driving their trucks in the first place. So it's not just that the Taliban has to succeed at managing the principal agent problem. They have to have the appearance of succeeding to even start people's trust in the first place. So this forces us to ask, or gives rise to a new question, which is how do insurgents decide to defect? We need to look at the cost-benefit analysis of particular defections. And we need to ask what it is that insurgents want to maximize in each recruit, right? Insurgents want recruits who feel that the cost of defection is very, very high. And what are the costs? Well, if we believe that the rebel group in question actually has the capacity to track down defectors and punish them, the punishment is the cost. But we know that that doesn't happen very often, right? For the amount of money you can get from hijacking a truck on this trade route, you can get out of Afghanistan and slip out of the Taliban's grasp. So what is the cost of defection? Well, it's really a loss of community. It's really the loss of feeling like you were participating in an organization that mattered. And so the sacrifices that you make, the costs of participating, need to be lower than the cost of defection. right? So what happens when a group of terrorists or a rebel group has a reservation value that's really low, by which I mean the insurgents feel like defection is not particularly costly? They fail, right? The Jewish underground is an example of this for Berman. The Jewish underground targeted civilian Palestinians in a terror campaign in an attempt to remove them from territory that the Jewish underground wanted the Israeli state to control. But the targeting of civilian Palestinians made lots of people in the Jewish underground feel bad. They didn't believe in their mission enough to continue to participate in this group, and so they defected. When they were offered selective incentives to defect, they left, and they provided information to the Israeli state that allowed for them to dismantle the Jewish underground. The organization failed. Okay, so we've sort of been dancing around this same problem from a number of different angles. But the point that we're coming to here is that terrorists and rebel groups often argue that recruitment is very important. You need to recruit trustworthy people. But how does this happen? What are the most efficient or effective ways to recruit people that are going to stay loyal? This leads to a second theoretical puzzle. Why would anyone join a group that demands them to sacrifice so much? Think about the types of sacrifices that religions demand, right? So Berman starts his theory with the last question. What's the answer? What is it that people get out of religious groups that ask them to sacrifice, that ask them to speak strange languages, to eat strange food, to wear strange clothing, to remove themselves from the influences of the world that they might find tempting or tantalizing? Why would anyone do this? For mutual aid. Here we have a picture of an Amish barn raising. We know that the incentive to free ride here is going to be strong in the same way that it's strong for Taliban soldiers who might hijack a truck, and strong in the same way that it might be strong for Jewish underground soldiers who feel that murdering Palestinians is a bad idea and are willing to defect. Once the community helps you raise your barn, why would you ever go raise someone else's? You could free ride very, very easily. And this sort of problem arises in a number of different religious societies, right? Here we have an Islamic lending group. The people who belong to the group put a specific amount of money in every month, and then the council of the group hears arguments about who should be lent that capital for the month, whose family is in a particularly bad situation, who has a particularly good business opportunity. And of course, the temptation would be to abscond with the money and never put in your kitty again, right? So Berman argues that religious societies, because they engage in mutual aid that provides a massive economic benefit, have to solve certain problems with respect to the principal agent problem, or with respect to free riding. They have practice in coming up with institutional solutions. How, Berman argues, do these religions solve shirking? Well, they impose these crazy requirements. And they impose these crazy requirements, and they force you to adhere by these crazy requirements for a long time before they allow you to get access to the mutual aid. Berman argues anyone who's willing to take on these sacrifices in order to get access to the mutual aid in the first place is less likely to shirk once it's their turn to put in to the mutual aid. They've already shown that they're interested in being part of this mutual aid society. Right? So we have a selection on character mechanism. Only people who are willing to engage in great sacrifice for an organization, people who are psychologically interested in being part of that community, are going to survive in the group until they get the aid. Second, we end up with codependent communities, right? The people that you screw over for the aid have multiple connections to you. By the time you've given up alcohol and the ability to drive cars, and you've been speaking this old version of High German for 40 years, and all of these, you've become somewhat useless to the outside world, and you've cloistered yourself into a community that has multifaceted interactions of exactly the sort that Taylor argues creates strong communities. You also end up with dependency on the community. You've spent so much time studying the Talmud that you don't understand calculus. You've spent so much time learning the weird forms of Dutch that you need to speak with your elders that you haven't spent any time learning the proper grammar for the language that you actually speak. One of the reasons that lots of Amish people come back from Rumspringa is that they don't fit in well in the outside world after years of living with Amish values. For those of you who've never heard of this before, the Amish, who deny themselves lots of modern conveniences, allow their children to leave for a number of years after they reach the age of adulthood. They're allowed to go out into the world and do whatever they want. They can drink, they can use drugs, they can have sex outside of marriage, and all of these things are forgiven provided that at the end of Rumspringa they come back to the Amish community. Those of us who live in the modern world, in a society that is not multifaceted, that doesn't demand any sacrifices from us, might look at the fact that the vast majority of the Amish return to their communities after Rumspringa as proof of insanity. Why on earth would you give these things up? Why wouldn't you assimilate into the modern world that offers you so much more? Well, one of the answers that Berman offers to this confusion is that these people can't, right? They've been put into a position where they're codependent on their communities, and the things that they know are the only things that they're qualified to do. We see this in places other than religious organizations. Face tattoos serve this kind of purpose for gang members. What does your grandmama say whenever someone walks into TGI Fridays with a face tattoo? How is that person ever going to find a job? Well, what is the answer to that question? They're not, right? They're not going to find a job. And the reason that they got these face tattoos in the first place is to demonstrate to their community that they don't want those jobs. They don't want to turn outside of the insular community of which they are a part. This is a costly signal that makes their commitment to this organization credible in the long run. They're signaling that they are worthy of the mutual aid that this society is going to provide to them down the line. So in sum, the religious society, or belonging to these religious societies, is profitable once you're through to the other side. And only people that can handle this cost get the benefit of being part of a strong community. Okay, so what does this have to do with violence and the puzzle of secrecy, right? I should take this point, or stop here for a second, to clarify pretty strenuously that Berman doesn't think that people who belong to religious cults are necessarily any more violent than others. It's not that deeply religious people are violent, it's that deeply religious people are better at violence. Once someone makes that transition into being radicalized in terms of violence, in addition to being radicalized in terms of the demands that their religious order puts on them, they are not principal agent risks in the same way that people who are recruited into organizations using cheap talk, right? Someone who just tells you that they're willing to be part of the rebel organization is tempted to cheat and willing to cheat in a way that someone who's been selected for a religious organization, a narrow religious organization, on the basis of their character and willingness to sacrifice is no longer a threat. The people and communities that fit these categories make better terrorists, right? So if we track back through these three puzzles, we see that religious terrorists are more successful. The Taliban succeeded because they recruited Muslims who were willing to forego lots and lots of modern conveniences, lots and lots of the benefits of open society in order to have the advantage of the strong community on the other side. They recruited people who were unwilling to leave these extremely sect-like and conservative forms of Islam, knowing that they were getting characters who were less likely to defect in a principal agent problem. Okay. Evidence that Berman provides for the fact that his theory is true. A handful of observable implications or hypotheses here. First, in green, radical religious communities should be tighter than other social groups, by which he means they should be smaller. And again, we're engaging in this sort of Humphreys and Weinstein style assumption where we assume that communities that are smaller also have these multifaceted links that allow you to generate selective cultural incentives that we in large communities that have single-dimensional relationships simply can't achieve. Even accepting the fact that these communities are smaller, they should minimize outside contacts. People shouldn't spend social time with those who are outside of their sect. They should have smaller congregations and yet have higher attendance at services. Sects should draw a massive proportion of people to really long, onerous services in a way that makes regular mainstream religions jealous. They should have less education. Members of these sects should have less education and they should earn less. But despite the fact that they have less education, despite the fact that they earn less, they should donate a greater proportion of their income to charity. This is evidence of their commitment. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the tests that Berman provides in the reading that I actually assigned. Members of sects spend more time in church, and they have a higher percentage of friends from their church, right? The more, as you get to very church-like organizations, the Catholic Church, mainstream Islam, mainstream Judaism, lots of people only have a couple of friends from their church. They have other friends from other walks of life, but these sect-like organizations, right? I mean, there's all these jokes about once you're in your late 20s, how do you have 3 friends? Well, all of them come from your church if you're the member of a sect. Sects are smaller. They have a smaller number of members. And these members belong to fewer non-church organizations, so they're limiting their contacts outside of the sect. Sect members have lower incomes, and they contribute more to the church as a percentage of income. More observable implications of Berman's theory that are true. Finally, I think this is a pretty interesting one. Berman measures this particularly in the case of Israel. Fertility is only rising among radical sects of religions in these developed countries, right? Even among mainstream Muslims who live in Israel, fertility is on the decline. Only among ultra-Orthodox Jews is it rising. We have examples of this in the United States. Citizens or groups of citizens that are truly outliers. These women are dressed in the traditional dress of the Hutterites. This is a group that settled in North Dakota during the early 1900s. When they settled in North Dakota, there were something like 30 of them, and today there are something like 3,000. This is possible over the course of a couple of generations because the Hutterites have extremely high modern birth rates. In the modern United States, the average Hutterite woman has 9.9 children, right? Which is something like 8 times higher than the average American. Okay, so actually this discussion question relates better to next week's reading about civilian casualties, so maybe we can revisit that then. But think instead about the problem that rebel groups are facing here as they're recruiting individuals. They know that they can do things like threaten people, give people selective enticements, selectively target the poor. But those strategies don't seem to work very well when it comes to recruiting agents that are trustworthy. Instead, what they should be doing, but according to the Humphreys and Weinstein evidence are not doing, is infiltrating communities. Infiltrating communities that have close norms of reciprocity, multi-dimensional relationships between individuals, and hijack the willingness of people to belong to those organizations, the vulnerability of people who have come to belong to those organizations in order to generate a cadre of highly trusting soldiers. Okay, I will see you all on Wednesday when we will discuss civilian abuse in the theoretical section of our lecture, and then I will look forward to seeing your presentations on